Chapter 38. Spit. At this point in my story, Gram interrupted. "Oh, yes, yes, yes," she said. "I've been waiting for that kiss for days." I do like a story with some good kisses in it. "She's such a gooseberry," Gram said. We were churning through Montana. I didn't dare check our progress on the map. I didn't want to discover that we couldn't make it in time. I thought that if I kept talking and praying underneath, and if we kept moving along these mountainous roads, we had a chance. Gram said, "But what about Peavy? What about her mother kissing the lunatic? I didn't like that kiss very much. It was the other one I liked, the one with Ben." I found Phoebe at the bus stop, sitting on the bench. "Where were you?" she asked. I did not tell her about seeing Ben or his mother. I wanted to, but I couldn't. "I was afraid, Phoebe, I couldn't stay there. And I thought you were the brave one," she said. "Oh well, it doesn't matter. Nothing matters. I'm sick of it." "What happened?" "Nothing. They sat there on the bench having a gay old time. If I could toss rocks like you can toss rocks, I'd have plunked them both in the back of their heads." "Did you notice her hair? She's cut it. It's short. And do you know what else she did? In the middle of talking, she leaned over and spit on the grass." "Spit? It was disgusting. And the lunatic, do you know what he did when she spit? He laughed. Then he leaned over and he spit." "Why would they do that?" "Who knows? I'm sick of it. My mother can stay there for all I care. She doesn't need me. She doesn't need any of us." Phoebe was like that all the way home on the bus. She was in an extensively black mood. We got to Phoebe's house just as her father pulled in the driveway. Prudence rushed out of the house saying, She called! She called! She called! Mom called! She's coming home!" "Terrific," Phoebe murmured. "What was that, Phoebe?" her father said. "Nothing." "She's coming tomorrow," Prudence said. "But what's wrong?" her father said. "What else did she say?" "She sounded nervous. She wanted to talk with you." "Did she leave a number? I'll call her back." "No, she didn't leave any number. She said to tell you not to make any prejudgments." "What is that supposed to mean?" her father said. "Not make any prejudgments about what?" "I don't know," Prudence said. "Oh, most important, she said that she was bringing someone with her." "That's just grand," Phoebe said. "Just grand." "Phoebe," her father said. "Prudence, did she say who she's bringing?" "I honestly could not say." "Did she refer to this person at all? Did she mention a name?" He was getting agitated. "Why, no," Prudence said. "She didn't mention a name. She just said that she was bringing him with her." "Him?" Phoebe looked at me. "Cripes," she said, and she went into the house, slamming the door behind her. I couldn't believe it. Wasn't she going to tell her father what she had seen? I was bursting at the seams to tell my own father, but when I got home, he and Margaret were sitting on the porch. Margaret said, "My brother told me you're in his English class. What a surprise!" She must have already told my father this because he didn't look too surprised. "He's a terrific teacher. Do you like him?" "I suppose." I didn't want to talk about it. I wanted Margaret to vanish. I had to wait until she went home to tell my father about Phoebe's mother, and when I did tell him, all he said was, "So Mrs. Winterbottom is coming home. That's good." Then he went over to the window and stared out of it for the longest time, and I knew he was thinking about my mother. All that night I thought about Phoebe and Prudence and Mr. Winterbottom. It seemed like their whole world was going to fall apart the next day when Mrs. Winterbottom walked in, all cuddly with the lunatic. Chapter 39. Homecoming. The next morning Phoebe phoned begging me to come over. "I can't stand it," she said. "I want a witness." "For what?" "I just want a witness." Did you tell your father about your mother and are you kidding? Phoebe said. You should see him. He and Prudence spent all last night and this morning cleaning the house. They've scrubbed the floors and bathrooms, they dusted like fiends, they did laundry and ironing, and they vacuumed. Then they took a good look around. My father said, maybe it looks too good, your mother will think we can function without her, so they messed things up. He's very put out with me that I wouldn't help. I did not want to be a witness to anything, but I felt guilty for running away the day before, and so I agreed. When I got to our house, Phoebe, Mr. Winterbottom, and Prudence were sitting there staring at each other. Didn't she say what time she was coming? Mr. Winterbottom asked. Prudence said, no, she did not, and I wish you would quit acting as if it is my fault that she did not say more than she did. Mr. Winterbottom was a wreck. He jumped up to straighten the pillow, sat back down, and then he leaped up to mess up the pillow again. He went out in the yard and walked around in circles. He changed his shirt twice. I hope you don't mind that I'm here, I said. Why would I mind? Mr. Winterbottom said. Just as I thought they would all go to start raving mad, a taxi pulled up outside. I can't look, Mr. Winterbottom said, escaping to the kitchen. I can't look either, Phoebe said. She followed her father, and I followed Phoebe. Well, gosh, Prudence said. I don't know what has gotten into everybody. Aren't you excited to see her? From the kitchen, we heard Prudence open the front door. We heard Mrs. Winterbottom say, "Oh, sweetie." And Mr. Winterbottom wiped the kitchen counter. We heard Prudence gasp and her mother say, I'd like you to meet Mike. Mike? Mr. Winterbottom said. He was quite red in the face. I was glad there was no axe in the house, or I am fairly certain he would have picked it up and headed straight for Mike. Phoebe said, Now, Dad, don't do anything too rash. Mike? He repeated. Mrs. Winterbottom called, George, Phoebe. We heard her say to Prudence, Where are they? Didn't you tell them we were coming? Mr. Winterbottom took a deep breath. Phoebe, I'm not sure you or Sal should be around for this. Are you kidding? Phoebe said. He took another deep breath. Okay, he said, okay. Here we go. He stood up straight and tall and walked through the living room. Phoebe and I followed. Honest and truly, I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away on the carpet. There were two reasons for this. The first one was that Mrs. Winterbottom looked different. Her hair was not only short but also quite stylish. She was wearing lipstick, mascara, and a little blush on her cheeks, and her clothes were altogether unlike anything I had ever seen her in. A white t-shirt, blue jeans, and flat black shoes. Dangling from her ears were thin silver hoop earrings. She looked magnificent, but she did not look like Phoebe's mother. The second reason that I think Phoebe nearly fainted dead away was that there was Mike Bickle, Phoebe's potential lunatic, in her own living room. It was one thing to think he was coming, and another thing to actually see him standing there. I didn't know what to think. For a second I thought maybe Mike had kidnapped Mrs. Winterbottom and was bringing her back for some ransom money, or maybe he was now going to do away with the rest of us. But I kept thinking of seeing them together the day before, and besides, Mrs. Winterbottom looked too terrific to have been held captive. She did look frightened, but not of Mike. She seemed afraid of her husband. Dad, Phoebe whispered. That's the lunatic. Oh, Phoebe, her mother said, pressing her fingers to her cheek. And when she made that familiar gesture, Phoebe looked as if her heart was splitting into 1,000 pieces. Mrs. Winterbottom hugged Phoebe, but Phoebe did not hug her back. Mr. Winterbottom said, Norma, I hope you're going to explain exactly what is going on here. He was trying to make his voice firm, but it trembled. Prudence stared at Mike. She seemed to find him handsome and was flirting with him. She fluffed her hair away from her neck. Mrs. Winterbottom tried to put her arms around Mr. Winterbottom, but he pulled away. "I think we deserve an explanation," he said. He too stared at Mike. Was she in love with Mike? He seemed awfully young, not much older than Prudence. Mrs. Winterbottom sat down on the sofa and began to cry. It was a terrible moment. It was hard to make any sense out of what she said at first. She was talking about being respectable and how maybe Mr. Winterbottom would never forgive her, but she was tired of being so respectable. She had tried very hard all these years to be perfect, but she had to admit that she was quite unperfect. She said there was something that she had never told her husband, and she feared he would not forgive her for it. Mr. Winterbottom's hands trembled. He did not say anything. Mrs. Winterbottom motioned for Mike to join her on the sofa. Mr. Winterbottom cleared his throat several times, but still he said nothing. Mrs. Winterbottom said, "Mike is my son." Mr. Winterbottom, Prudence, Phoebe, and I all said, "Your son?" Mrs. Winterbottom stared at her husband. "George, I know you will think I am not, or was not, respectable, but it was before I met you, and I had to give him up for adoption, and I could hardly bear to think of it, and..." Mr. Winterbottom said, "Respectable? Respectable? The hell with respectable!" Mr. Winterbottom did not normally swear. Mrs. Winterbottom stood up. "Mike found me, and at first I was frightened of what that would mean. I've lived such a tiny life." Phoebe took her father's hand. "And I had to go away and sort things out. I haven't yet met Mike's adoptive parents, but Mike and I have spent a lot of time talking, and I've been thinking." Mike looked down at his feet. "Are you going to leave?" Mr. Winterbottom asked. Mrs. Winterbottom looked as if he had slapped her. "Leave?" "Again, I mean," Mr. Winterbottom said. "Only if you want me to," she said. "Only if you cannot leave with such an unrespectable..." "I said to hell with respectable," Mr. Winterbottom said. "What's all this about respectable? It's not respectable I'm concerned about. I'm more concerned that you couldn't or wouldn't tell me about any of this." Mike stood up. "I knew it wouldn't work," he said. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I have nothing against you, Mike. I just don't know you." He looked at his wife. "I don't think I know you either." I was wishing I was invisible. Outside, the leaves were falling to the ground, and I was infinitely sad down to my bones. I was sad for Phoebe and her parents and her Prudence and Mike. Sad for the leaves that were dying, and sad for myself, for something I had lost. I saw Mrs. Partridge through the window, standing on Phoebe's front walk. Mr. Winterbottom said, "I think we all need to sit down and talk. Maybe we can sort something out." Then he did what I think was a noble thing. He went over to Mike and shook his hand and said, "I did always think a son would be a nice addition to this family." Mrs. Winterbottom looked relieved. Prudence smiled at Mike. Phoebe stood motionless off to the side. "I'd better go," I said. Everyone turned to me as if I had just dropped through the roof. Mr. Winterbottom said, "So, I'm sorry, I truly am." To Mike he said, "Sal is like another member of the family." Mrs. Winterbottom said, "You're mad at me, aren't you, Phoebe?" "Yes," Phoebe said. "I most certainly am." Phoebe took my sleeve and pulled me toward the door. "When you all decide exactly how many people are in this family, let me know." We stepped out on the porch just as Mrs. Partridge placed a white envelope on the steps.